Welcome. Today we are going to start learning about learning. So this will be Unit 4. Now, just a quick little note. The information that I'm pulling this from doesn't actually come from our textbook for this unit. And I will upload the PDF of the chapter from the textbook we are using for this unit if you want to reference it on Google Classroom. But today we're going to get started and we're going to learn about how we learn. So this section is called Module 26, How We Learn and Classical Conditioning. All right, so what is learning? So learning is a process where a person gains, or an animal or an organism. So learning is a process in which one gains either information or behaviors that are going to last for a relatively permanent time, and we gain this information or behaviors through experience. So if you think about it like if you learned how to ride a bike as a child, there was a process where you had to gain that behavior and you had to learn that behavior. So that's really what learning is. This is our definition of learning. In your notes, I would like you to write an example of something you learned, either a piece of information or a behavior as a child that you still perform today or can recall today. Okay, so how do we learn? So one big, huge way we learn, and we're going to talk a lot about, is through association. So when we have one stimulus, and that stimulus gets paired with a certain response, we learn that this stimulus causes this response, and we associate them together. And so this is prevalent throughout like so much of our lives. But one example is when you were a little kid, when you went to school in kindergarten for the first time, when the bell rang, that probably did not mean much to you unless you had older siblings, but that probably did not mean much to you at the time. However, as the days went on that you went into school, you probably learned that when the bell rings, that means it's time to go home. So you associated the bell ringing with going home. And so that's the basic premise of associations. There's also like, if you cut off all your sister's hair, you got in trouble. That's another example of an association. So associative learning is huge. It's like probably one of the biggest ways in which we learn. And associations can actually end up leading to habits. And basically, a habit is a continuous response to an original association. So if you have the habit when you're in school of packing up right before the bell rings, that's because you learned a long time ago that the bell ringing means it's time to go home. So that's an example of a habit. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of habits in your life that you learned based off an earlier association that you learned. Then we've got cognitive learning, and we will talk about that later, but it's basically we get mental information that guides our behavior. And then we have observational learning. This is where we learn from seeing what other people are doing. So kind of like monkey see, monkey do kind of situation. Now, companies like Coca-Cola know that humans learn by making associations. So to get us to buy more soda, they have smartly paired their product with something that makes a lot of people happy, which is Christmas. So a lot of times you'll see those Coca-Cola commercials around Christmas time with a Santa drinking the Coca-Cola, or maybe the polar bears or whatever. I mean, the fact that I can even remember this is a great example of their effective marketing. But they use associations to get us to buy their products. So this is prevalent throughout our life. Okay, so how we and other organisms learn. So, like I said, we learn by associations. Now, can you think of a way in which an animal that you know of, what do they do that you know that they have learned? It's not like an instinct or an innate response. What is a behavior that maybe an animal can learn that you know that they learn? And I want you to think about that. Like for me, my dog, Dixie, when I go bang, bang, she rolls up onto her backside and plays dead. I know that she learned that because I taught her that. Whereas, eating food, I did not really teach her to eat. Okay, so there is a few things that can happen. One thing that can happen is this thing called habituation. So habituation occurs when a human or animal learns by association something to expect. And in essence, their response is diminished. Now, this is very similar to sensory adaptation if you're paying attention and making those connections. However, sensory adaptation is slightly different because sensory adaptation is basically much more temporary. And let's say you became nose blind to the smells in your room, okay? With sensory adaptation, if the smell changed in the room, you would notice the difference. But with habituation, even if a stimulus change occurred, that would not happen because you have been so overexposed to that stimulus that the response gets diminished almost totally. An example of this is like with a little sea sponge, or I can't remember, like an anemone. They're used to getting crashed by the waves, and usually they will recoil when that happens. But since it happens literally all day, every day, eventually they become habituated to that experience, and so they don't do that anymore because they know to expect it. So, like I said earlier, when we pair two things together, this is called associative learning because you're making an association. And we'll talk more about this, but this is kind of a joke about some psychology research that was done. A lot of behavioral research has been done on rats and cats. Those are the two main guys that get experimented on. Okay, so types of associative learning. We've got classical conditioning, where we associate two stimuli, and then this causes us to anticipate those events. So associated stimuli cause us to respond automatically. And so we call this respondent behavior. We're going to get into this in way greater detail. So don't freak out because you're like, what the heck does that mean? So classical conditioning, just like I said, it's kind of like the bell example. You associated the bell with leaving, and so that's what you learned. And then you would pack up to leave. That would be your response. Operant conditioning is when you associate a behavior to a consequence, and a consequence could be both positive or negative. So let's say you as a child, when you were little, every time you got an A, your parents gave you, I don't know, $5. That would be an example of positive reinforcement. They're trying to increase your behavior, and then your brain learns, oh, when I do this, I get rewarded. So I'm going to do that more. That's operant conditioning. Okay. So really quickly, I want you to do a check for understanding in the bottom box of your notes. I would like you to write a time from your childhood where you learned something from classical conditioning methods, like some kind of association you made just between two stimuli. And then I would like you to do that also for operant conditioning, a time where you learned this behavior gets me this consequence, which could be positive or negative. Okay? I'll give you a minute to do that. All right. So we're going to talk about classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning is basically the beginning parts of the school of behaviorism. And this all really started with this guy named Ivan Pavlov. Does the name Ivan Pavlov ring a bell? So Pavlov really pioneered the research in classical conditioning, which, like I said, it laid the foundation for the school of behaviorism to arise. And what did behaviorists believe should be studied? Answer that for me in your notes, and we'll talk about that later. What did behaviorists believe we could study? All right. And then in your notes, I would also like you to do, I'd like you to make a little chart if you can. This is called a KWL. So tell me what you already know in the far left column about Pavlov's experiments. Then in the middle, I want you to tell me what you do know. And then once we finish our notes on this, I want you to go back and fill in that right column on what you've learned. Okay. You'll just make this as a table in your notes, or if you do it handwritten, just draw it out. Either works. All right, so Pavlov's experiment. So Pavlov actually was originally like a physician. He was trying to learn about saliva in dogs, digestion. But this is what happened. Over time, he noticed that the dogs were salivating because that's what he was measuring. He was measuring the dog's salivation in their mouth. And he noticed that the dogs were starting to salivate even before food was present. So when they would hear footsteps in the lab before they were presented with food, he noticed that they started salivating. So he wanted to see if he could teach these dogs associations that could cause them to salivate. Okay? Because basically he wanted to see, oh, why is this happening? Why are they salivating when there's not food in front of them? So the first thing you have to do with classical conditioning is find an unconditioned stimulus, basically meaning untaught, something that you do not have to teach. This kind of stimulus has to cause a response in someone naturally. So for the dogs experiment, okay, the unconditioned stimulus would be the meat, because the meat, the food that they're getting fed, is going to naturally lead to, like reflexively almost, salivation. So the unconditioned stimulus has to be something that leads to a natural response. If we think about this with humans, you can think about maybe something like this really applies to like fear. And we'll talk about this later, but like I'm afraid of birds. The unconditioned stimulus originally probably would be like being bitten. Being bitten causes fear. Okay. So that would be the unconditioned stimulus here. In this example, it would be the meat. We also call this the UCS. So remember those terms. Okay. So then Pavlov noted that the unconditioned stimulus, so in the dog condition, it's the meat, the unconditioned leads to an unconditioned response, an untaught response, which in this case, the dog case, was salivation. Okay, so the meat, the UCS leads to the UCR, which is salivation. Now, I, Pavlov, want to teach the dogs to salivate to the sound of a bell. So what I have to do is I need to pair the unconditioned stimulus with a bell. So what I will do, and this is what we call the neutral stimulus, what I will do is I will basically ring a bell, give them the food, they will salivate. So the neutral stimulus has to come before the unconditioned stimulus, has to precede it, so they can learn to predict what's going to happen. I ring the bell, I give them the meat, they salivate. Because if I gave them the meat and then I rang the bell, they would not learn that the bell predicts getting the meat. So I have to ring the bell first, then give them the meat, then they'll salivate. If we do this over and over and over again, and over and over and over again, actually it's not that much, but let's say I do it 10 times. Eventually what's going to happen is ringing the bell, which is the neutral stimulus, will become a conditioned stimulus, meaning it will be learned. And ringing the bell should cause the dogs even without the presentation of meat, to salivate. So the conditioned response does not change from the unconditioned response. Those two things are the same. So like I said, the unconditioned stimulus originally leads to the unconditioned response. Then you pair the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. This leads to the unconditioned response. You do this over and over and over again, and eventually the conditioned stimulus will lead to the conditioned response. Now, let's do this with the dog example. The unconditioned stimulus here is the meat. The unconditioned response is salivation. Now, I want to train them to learn this bell to salivate. So I'm going to pair the bell as the conditioned stimulus with the meat, which will lead to salivation. I'm going to do this again and again, and eventually this will lead me to ringing the bell, which will cause them to do what? Even without meat being presented, what should the dogs do? If I've done it enough, if I ring the bell, what should the dogs do? You tell me in your notes. Now, one thing to note is that conditioned responses with classical conditioning, we usually call these kinds of responses visceral responses, meaning they're responses of the internal organs. Things are happening usually within us kind of uncontrollably. So salivation is an example of that. With my fear of birds, right? When I get afraid, it's not like I'm choosing to be afraid. My heart starts racing, maybe my pupils dilate, certain things like that. So yeah, classically conditioned responses tend to be visceral responses. And this is where we're going to pause today, and we will learn more next time. All right, I will see you later. I hope you have a lot of questions because this is a tough one, and kids get confused, so please come prepared with your questions. I will see you later. Bye.